Lena had always valued silence, which was exactly why she chose the apartment. It sat at the very end of a long hallway, isolated from the rest of the building, in a way that made it feel almost separate from everything else. The walls were thick, the floors barely creaked, and most nights passed without a single sound. It was the kind of place where even the smallest noise felt noticeable, and that quiet had always comforted her. That was why she noticed the change immediately. It began one night, long after midnight, when she paused in the middle of her routine because something felt off. At first, she thought it was nothing more than a faint sound carried through the building, something distant and unimportant. But as she stood still and listened more carefully, the noise became clearer, forming into something that made her chest tighten slightly. It wasn't random. It wasn't the usual creaks or pipes adjusting. It was a voice. The sound was soft and low, just beyond full clarity, but steady enough to feel intentional. It didn't sound like someone calling out or reacting to anything. It sounded like someone speaking calmly, as though continuing a conversation that had already been going on for some time. Lena slowly turned her head toward the hallway, her focus sharpening as she tried to understand where it was coming from. The more she listened, the more certain she became that the voice wasn't distant at all. It was close, far too close to be ignored. Carefully, she stepped out into the hallway, her movements slow and deliberate. The voice continued, growing clearer with each step she took, though the words themselves still slipped just beyond her understanding. It drew her forward until she found herself standing at the very end of the hall, facing the wall she knew had nothing behind it but the outside of the building. And yet, the voice was coming from there. She stared at the surface, her brow tightening as confusion settled in. There was no logical explanation for it. She knew the layout of the apartment. She knew what was on the other side. Still, the sound persisted, steady and calm, as though unaware of her presence. Lena hesitated before reaching out and placing her hand against the wall. The moment her palm made contact, the voice stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, pressing in around her in a way that made her uncomfortable. She waited, holding her breath, expecting the voice to return, but it didn't. After a few seconds, she slowly pulled her hand away, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, she convinced herself it was nothing. Old buildings carried sound in strange ways, and it was easier to accept that explanation than anything else. Still, the feeling stayed with her as she returned to her room that night. The following evening, it happened again. This time, the voice started earlier, and it was clearer. Lena was sitting on her bed when she heard it, her body going still as the sound reached her ears. She didn't move right away. Instead, she listened carefully, her attention narrowing as the voice continued speaking in that same calm, steady tone. There was something different about it now, something she couldn't ignore. The more she focused on it, the more familiar it sounded, and that realization made her heart begin to race. Slowly, she stood up, her eyes fixed on the wall as she tried to process what she was hearing. It wasn't just similar to her voice, it was identical. Lena shook her head, her breathing becoming uneven as she tried to reject the thought. It wasn't possible. There had to be another explanation, something she was missing. But before she could convince herself otherwise, the voice spoke again, this time clear enough for her to understand. It told her she shouldn't be there. The words sent a cold feeling through her chest, and without thinking, she moved toward the hallway again. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps. She needed to understand what was happening, needed to prove to herself that this wasn't real. When she reached the wall, she leaned in closer, pressing her ear against the surface. The voice responded almost immediately, as though it had been waiting for her. It sounded calm, certain, and completely aware. Lena pulled back slightly, her eyes widening as the realization settled in. This wasn't just a sound echoing through the building. It wasn't random or accidental. It was responding to her. She forced herself to speak, her voice quieter than she intended as she asked who was there. For a brief moment, there was no answer, and she almost felt relieved. But then the voice returned, and the response made her chest tighten. It told her that she was the one on the other side. The statement didn't make sense, but the certainty behind it made it difficult to dismiss. Lena tried to steady herself, whispering that none of this was real, but the voice answered again in a calm, almost reassuring tone, as though it understood her doubt. Then came a knock. It was soft at first, just 3 slow taps against the wall. Lena stared at the surface as the sound came again, slightly louder this time. The rhythm was deliberate, controlled, and far too intentional to ignore. She took a step back as something about the wall began to shift. At first it was barely noticeable, like a subtle distortion in the surface. But within seconds, it became more obvious. The wall didn't crack or break. Instead, it seemed to stretch as though something behind it was pressing forward. A shape began to form. It looked like a hand. Lena's breath caught as she stumbled backward, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The surface bent outward under the pressure, as though something was trying to push through from the other side. Panic took over. She turned and rushed back into her room, shutting the door behind her and pressing herself against it. Her breathing was uneven as she tried to think, but the voice didn't stop. It wasn't distant anymore. It felt close, closer than it should have been. The voice spoke again, calm as ever, telling her that she was making things more difficult than they needed to be. Lena shook her head, whispering for it to go away, but the response came quickly, and this time it made her stomach drop. It told her she was in the wrong place. Lena insisted the apartment was hers, but the silence that followed made her doubt settle deeper. When the voice finally spoke again, it did so with quiet certainty, as though correcting a simple mistake. Then came another knock. This time, it didn't come from the wall. It came from her bedroom door. Lena froze, her eyes locking onto it, as 3 slow taps echoed through the room. She hadn't heard anyone enter. She knew the apartment door was locked. There was no reason for anyone to be standing on the other side. And yet, the voice came again. Now it was right outside. It called her name and asked her to open the door, and the sound of it sent a chill through her entire body because it matched her voice perfectly. Every detail was the same, down to the smallest inflection. Lena shook her head, refusing to move as she whispered that she wouldn't open it. For a moment, everything went quiet, and she thought it might be over. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark hallway beyond. Standing there was a figure that made Lena's thoughts collapse into silence. It looked exactly like her. The same face, the same posture, the same presence. But there was something wrong in the way it held itself, something unnatural in the stillness of its gaze. It stepped into the room and closed the door behind it with a soft, deliberate motion. Lena couldn't move as it took another step closer, its eyes fixed entirely on her. Then it smiled. It told her calmly and without hesitation that she was in its room. And in that moment, Lena understood that whatever had been behind the wall was no longer there. It was here, its mythic Murmurs.